All right, so we're gonna get us started now. It's 6 o'clock here in Northern Ireland, Belfast, and then we have Lynn Mario de Souza. Souza, how would you pronounce your last name?
Souza.
Souza. Okay, and then he's coming from Brazil, São Paulo, and I'm happy to have him here today with me in this sort of little chat exchange of conversations about many things. Um, a little bit of a background and context of how this came to be, just for you, Lynn, and our audience to know what this is about. When I was in the PhD, I used to have a podcast in which I would invite folks as well, and have a different discussions, both academic and personal. Finished the PhD as well, and then now I move into like academic world, scholarship, etc. And so I left the podcast and I decided to create this new adventure, sort of to try to legitimize other forms of knowledge creation and knowledge sharing. And it got me thinking a live session would be, I don't, not necessarily better, but at least at sometimes people come online. I have this chat box somewhere here, and people ask questions, and it's so you see, to legitimize, but to democratize knowledge. Like, it's not only two people, but people, if they want to come on the chat box to ask questions, that's great. And in a way, it's like sort of my little contribution to the academic world, to engage with communities, and that's why why I created this capsules or capsulas, is because you might know, Lynn, in our language, in both Spanish and Portuguese, we have the word pastillas or capsules or pills that at least in some sectors of Latin America, they call it pills, to these little nuggets of information that are critical, that you take them and then all of a sudden you become a little bit more aware of something that is happening, right? Like information, it could be little bits of information, concepts, theories, ideas, and that's what capsules is. And the X that everybody sees over there is just a little bit of I would say decolonial, to highlight the gender idea, that it doesn't have to be feminine or masculine, but also the idea that it could be capsules with an E in English, but capsulas with an A in Spanish. So that's kind of like the reason why we have this logo over here with that thing, right? And then the second thing that I wanted to bring before brought everybody here online, it's I wanted to share with all folks here. Let me see, because I really want to share the screen, something really quick. So I want to go here, and here you will see a white screen, obviously, because I this is a book that like I was invited to write a book chapter a few years back. I would say 5 years ago, roughly, when I went to Brazil for the ILA conference, and I met Kyria Finardi, and we exchanged different ideas and conversations. We right away we like each other academically, and then she had this vision of creating such a book, English in the South, right? And then we touched base a little bit after a while, and I said, well, I have an idea of something that I wanted always to put up together, and this seems to be like a good venue uh, for me to put it out. She agreed, and she encouraged me to write it up. And then, but she also invited Lynn to write in this book as well. And Lynn, obviously, you wrote the introduction here, and it was theorizing the South, or the Souths. And then we're gonna talk a little bit about what do we mean by South, what do we mean by South, and say, or Southern epistemology. We'll be discussing that in a moment. But the reason why I wanted to say this is because obviously I know Lynn Mario from not only from this book, but from other folks that we know in common. For us being I studied in Canada. Lynn was in Canada working with other folks in both research and etc. Other things that you maybe you want to tell us in a moment. And that's how I engage with that. And then here is Lynn Mario's introduction to theorizing the South. And then this is my chapter, which is how do you spell capital, examining Colombia's English language policy through critical lens. And that's how I wanted to share with you that this book is out there. Please reach out if any of you need it. I might have I think Kyria ran out of the tangible copies, but we may have some kind of like at least the proofs somewhere around to circulate around, because I think it has a lot of good value in the sense of the knowledge that's being produced. See, for example, chapters 1 to 5 here, talking about internationalization, language ideologies, or things related to foreign language education, epistemologies from the South, meaning from the Brazilian perspectives, and all things related to English as a lingua franca, English as a foreign language, etc. But everything from the sort of global South. And that's the topic for today. So before any fourth review, because I have talked too much and this not necessarily is about me, I just wanted to give a little bit of the background to folks out there to see where we are coming from. So what I wanted to introduce, it's Lynn Mario, and my first question to Lynn, which is not necessarily a question because I usually don't like to introduce folks because, sometimes it's prescriptives, these little paragraphs they give us about all the wonderful things that people have done, which in your case, you have done wonderful things both in Brazil, but also in Latin America, but also internationally. So I'm gonna give you some space for letting us know who you are, and whatever you wanna share, it's fine, as long or as short, personal or academic, anything that you think is of value that our audience or you wanna let our audience to know, and then we move from there.
Okay, thank you, Yesid. Thank you, especially for the opportunity and for your initiatives in getting to people other points of view and taking this very bottom-up initiative, starting from preoccupations of English and applied linguistics on the ground, rather than waiting for great institutions to begin the conversation. Let me say that I think, I believe that all theory, whatever, no matter how philosophical and abstract or it may be, all theory is connected to people who produce them. And therefore, all theory has some kind of biographical reason for existing. I don't think we get interested in anything without having some kind of biographical reason. It may be something very close, like what's happening to me today, or something distant, like my childhood, my youth. What influenced me in my youth suddenly is making me think the way I'm thinking today. But I think all theories are very much connected to who we are, to our biographies, right? Our personal histories. And when I say that, I mean that our personal histories are not individual, they're not personal, they're social histories, right? They happen in particular periods of time. They're influenced by the ideas and the policies and politics that are happening during our lives and before them. So I think that anything theoretical or abstract has this biographical basis to it. And that's what marks my work, I would say. So I'll begin from why I'm interested in language and linguistics. Well, my first degree, my BA is in theoretical linguistics. At the time, it was called linguistic science. In 1972, it was called linguistic science. So I graduated in linguistic science at the University of Reading, England, which at the time was the only university in Europe, I think, that had an undergraduate degree in linguistics. Linguistics was mainly either a discipline in other courses, or it was MA, a master's or a PhD discipline. It was very rarely at the time an undergraduate discipline, except for this course at the University of Reading, which I applied to, and I got in, and it was a very small course, very few vacancies at the time. There were only I think 11 or 12 vacancies. And why did I apply to do linguistics? Because I was interested in trying to understand a little bit about my own situation of language. I grew up in, my father's mother tongue was Portuguese. My mother's mother tongue was English. I was born in the Yemen, where the language of the street was Arabic. And I was sent to an Italian Catholic school. It was a British colony, so English was the official language. Both my parents had their origins in India, so my grandparents spoke Indian languages. And so I grew up in the middle of all of these different languages, which were not separated. No one ever said, speak this language or speak that language. We simply spoke to people in the way that we learned to speak to people, right? So we didn't know that there were different languages. And that was what interested me a lot. And I wanted to understand that. I wanted to understand the phenomenon of language, which was very dear to me at the time. And so when I entered university, I was 17, and I didn't really know what to expect. But I was certainly very disappointed when I started studying linguistics, because at the time, as you know, in 1972, linguistics was Chomskyan linguistics, generative linguistics. So they weren't interested with people. They weren't interested with the problems of language in particular contexts. They were interested in this very highly abstract, decontextualized mathematical view of language, which had nothing to do with me. And I thought, this is not language for me. I'm interested in speaking to people in different ways, I'm interested in when I say something, these people understand something else. So I was interested in language as a problem, as a complexity, not in language as a mathematical formula which could have established solutions. So that was the linguistics that unfortunately I encountered at university, and it was my great deception. Linguistics, which looked at itself as an abstract system, which was not concerned with communicative practice in specific situations. Linguistics was not concerned at the time with politics, with inequality, with injustice. And these were things that I was living as being born in a former colony, right? Growing up in England, not being white. So facing the racism in England, where people often told me, speak your language, when English was my language. So they were basically telling me, you have no right to be a mother tongue speaker of English, right? That's what, so all of these things made me interested in linguistics, but linguistics was not interested in them. So I was, towards the end of my course, I became more interested in linguistics, because that's when I started to do sociolinguistics and applied linguistics. They were optional areas of my undergraduate course. And in sociolinguistics, though the sociolinguistics at the time was not very political, it was more a description of different language variations like dialects, right? But at least there was an interest in people speaking not the way that they were supposed to speak. And at the time, it was William Labov producing his ideas of language variation in New York City. And that also I found very interesting. So suddenly, linguistics was speaking to me. It was saying, we are also interested in different ways of speaking, right? In different contexts. Now that was and it still is my linguistics, a linguistics of context, a linguistics of people, a linguistics of conflict, if you like, a linguistics which tells us that language is not simply transmitting messages. Language is basically perceiving that you don't understand and you need to understand. So it's about making an effort to understand, right? So this for me was what language is and still is. I'm talking about 1972, and now 50 years later, this is still very much connected to what I do. It's changed a lot. I don't do what I did exactly at the time, but I'm still motivated by this, trying to understand the complexity of language. So language is not something we can reduce to a mathematical formula. It's not something that we can reduce to a grammatical rule. Language is people, and people are different.
Yes.
Right? People have their lives, they live in different moments of history. People disagree with each other. People are different to each other, but people still have to live together on the same planet in the same context. So there is always, we may not disagree, we may not understand, but there is something that we have to share. Whether we like it or not, we have to share. So solidarity is extremely important, right, for me in language. And so these are the things that marked me. And what was another trauma that I had when I was graduating from linguistics, the thing that most of my colleagues were going into, the only job that available, or this is what we imagined, was to teach English as a foreign language. Right? And we were in England. So we were interviewed by language schools from London, because we were recent graduates of linguistics. They assumed that we would be better language teachers. And there was, I won't name it, but there was one very well-known language school in London at the time, very prestigious language school, which wanted to, which was interested in employing us as graduates of linguistics, right? So it called us all for interviews. Now, when it called me for an interview and I went in, and the first thing they told me is, you don't look like a native speaker of English. We want our teachers have to be native speakers of English. And unfortunately, you don't look like a native speaker of English. I found this so offensive, and it made it clear to me at the time that, oh, okay, so there are certain people who have a right to certain forms of language and others who don't have a right to certain forms of language, right? And so it was clear to me that I wouldn't be part of this club of people teaching English as a foreign language in London, because I didn't look like a native speaker of English. So I refused to be a teacher of English as a foreign language. And I ended up being a teacher of linguistics. But that is where my interest began, with this, who's right, who has ownership of language to say, so they can decide who looks like a native speaker. Mm-hmm. And then we have all kinds of things coming together. You see, this was London in the 1970s. This was a private language school, a very prestigious language school. Capitalism, making money, was involved. So the way that they maintained their privilege and their possibility of making profits was to maintain this image that they had the best English language teachers who looked white, probably.
Yes.
You had to look white and European, right? So that's how they guaranteed their profits. So that's where, it was clear to me then, how capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, all of these things come together in the teaching of language. So when we're learning and teaching language, it's not just about learning English. It's much more, they're much more involved. So I've always been interested in this much more.
Exactly. And you got me thinking, as you were speaking, Lynn, when you were saying that you didn't look like this native speaker. So, Jonathan Rosa has his book, Looking Like a Language and Sounding Like a Race. But obviously you felt this idea not yesterday or a couple years ago, as you mentioned, in the 70s. You were already experiencing. So this is nothing new. This idea of race and racial discrimination because of the language in connection with the race is nothing new. It's not nothing that it was invented a couple of years ago, 5 years ago, etc. People have lived this not only in North America but elsewhere, right? So in the book that I was showing earlier today, I know your introductory chapter was about theorizing the South. And obviously it comes because of that experiences from you coming from the global South, meaning Brazil, and obviously your background that you have provided today is mainly also speaks to it. So I wonder if you can explain a little bit what you mean by theorizing the South or speaking from the South. What does this mean for you?
Yeah.
Maybe elaborate a few minutes
Yeah,
more.
you know, that is a recent term in the last 10 years, perhaps 15 years. No, you know, when we came up with the concept of decolonization and Southern epistemology, it's probably the beginning of the new millennium, right? I think I have always worked with a different concept of South. For me, there, you know, that English expression to go south.
Oh, yeah, true.
To go south is to go bad. You know, things have gone south, meaning things have taken an unexpected turn for the worse. And I think, as you know, as I was rebelling against this racism in language, I was going south
You went
a
south.
long time before, right? So that, for me, going south and a southern view of language is always doing what is not expected, doing the unexpected, challenging normatization. For me, that's what the South means, challenging normatization. Who establishes normatization? And what do we do when we challenge normatization? Do we simply replace one norm with another? Then what has changed? Nothing has changed, because all norms are very exclusive, meaning they exclude various other forms of language, and they promote a very small part of the population. So norms are, you know, by definition, they're very excluding and unjust and unequal. So when we challenge a norm, I don't think, you know, speaking from this position of having been, having suffered for in terms of inequality by people who impose their particular norm, then for me the solution was not to change the norm. You know, because if you change the norm, you're just going to put another norm which is going to exclude other people. It's going to continue the injustice. For me, what the important thing was to try to understand, what does a norm do, and understand the fact that, so, you know, people thought when I was criticizing the norm many years ago, when I was doing, at the time I was doing my MA, and so people thought, okay, so what do you want? You're criticizing the norm, so you want language with no grammar? You know, that was the idea. So if you criticize the norm, you're criticizing grammar, and you're saying we don't need grammar. No, what I'm saying is we have to understand there are many grammars, right? There are many norms, but each norm is only valid in a particular context, in relation to a particular group of people, in relation to certain uses of language, right? Yeah. So when we are, you know, when we are texting to our friends informally, we're using a norm, right? We're using particular fixed expressions, we're using a particular grammar, we're using abbreviations, we're following a norm. We're not just using language as we individually want to, right? So when we use language informally, we use it formally. When we use it in speaking or in writing or whatever, we're following norms. So we have a multiplicity of norms and grammars, not a single norm or single grammar. So it's not a question of substituting one norm for another. It's understanding. For me, the important thing in looking at language from the South is understanding the contextuality of language, how language acquires meaning in context. You know, and one of the things we learned from Saussurean linguistics, where it were, you know, where Saussure said language is arbitrary. Arbitrary, what does arbitrary mean? Arbitrary means conventional. Arbitrary doesn't mean anything goes. Arbitrary means there is a kind of agreement. There are conventions in language. So people agree that a certain form of language is the preferred form, or a certain form of language is considered to be taboo. These are conventions. These are social agreements. They're not objective. They're totally subjective. But when something subjective is used and agreed upon by various people, it acquires this appearance of objectivity, right? And then it tends to acquire certain stability. But it's not stable. Language is never stable. No, all conventions change. So what was considered taboo some time ago is no longer taboo, right? Tomorrow it will be taboo again, and all of these different changes of language. So the important thing about grammars and norms in language is they are changeable. I'm sorry, excuse my dogs. They are changeable. Let me just check.
We love dogs. We're in a pluriversal conversation, so all beings are welcome.
Yeah, and they have language. They're speaking as well.
Exactly.
They're demanding attention. Right?
Exactly.
So I think conventionality is what characterizes language as a social phenomenon, right? And conventionality is an agreement. So it depends on who is agreeing to what. So what we have, just to put an end to this thing on norms, what we have are always multiple norms. But what's important is to understand what a norm, why a norm exists and what it does. It exists so to guarantee that that certain people can understand each other in certain contexts. That's all, right? In a different context, we need another norm to guarantee, again, understanding in that different context, right? So that's why, I mean, if we look at poetic language, it can be very difficult to understand, but it follows a literary norm. We have to learn how to read poetry, right? We can't read poetry as if it's a conversation. So the important thing about learning language is understanding these different conventionalities of language and learning how to navigate between these different conventionalities. And then when we get to the inequality and injustice of language, what colonialism did was it imposed the norms of the dominant communities on everybody else. Right?
Exactly. So something that you got me thinking is that, as you were saying, the South, it looks like the South, not that you said it, but in the imaginary, social imaginary, the South equals suffering. So it means everything that is related to the global South, or speaking from the South, or Southern epistemology, always means a struggle. If you are from the South, you have a struggle. If you are not from the South, whether it's geographically or political or spatial, then that means suffering versus not suffering. So in other words, if nobody from, let's say, Norway, Finland, Scandinavian countries, or Canada, whatever, they don't necessarily suffer, therefore they are not necessarily speaking from the South. However,
right,
some folks out there are saying somewhere in different spaces that there should not be these dichotomical ways, these binaries, global South, because what that does is to create tensions and divisions among people on planet Earth, etc. But I argue that it is necessary to mention the South because precisely is to highlight and amplify the work that has been done from folks who have actually suffered.
Yeah.
And by trying to blend them together or not mentioning or saying there shouldn't be any divide, you are erasing that suffering from the peoples from the South and the knowledges from the South. What are your thoughts on this idea that people want to blend them or say, oh, we don't want any binaries here and there?
No, I don't. Yeah, I don't like binaries either, but I don't think by saying that we let's throw away the binaries. I think we've got to make connections. Binaries tend to see things as being separate. I think we need the binaries, but not as binaries. We need to make connections between the binaries. So, for example, yeah, we could see the South as a place of suffering, but then let's connect this with the North as a place of profit. So the suffering in the South generated the profit of the North, right? Why is there no suffering in the North? Because over the last 200 years of history through colonization, the North benefited from the suffering of the South, benefited from the resources of the South. In order to the resources, the people in the South suffered to gather the resources to give them to the North. The North benefited, profited, became rich from the suffering of the South. The North promoted, developed modernity, the Industrial Revolution, science, modern science, and everything else, from the suffering of the South. So this connection has always to be made there. And I think it's important, Eduardo Galeano reminded us that he said, in the open veins of Latin America, he said, when he was looking at the suffering, he said, the people in the North have to remember that where did the steam engine come from? The steam engine that produced the industrial machines that produced the industry and the Industrial Revolution in the North. It came from the sugarcane in the South, right? It came from the slavery in the South. It came from the people who were forced as forced labor in the South. The money from the sugarcane and the production of cotton in the South was what produced the steam engine, the machines that produced the Industrial Revolution, right? Which what produces the state. If we continue that development, all the modern space exploration technology comes from that same history of the steam engine, right? If we didn't have the steam engine, we wouldn't have mechanical engineering, which then became the sophisticated engineering we have today, quantum engineering, etc., right? So the wealth of the North is directly connected to the suffering of the South. So I'm sorry, we cannot say that, okay, let's stop talking about binaries. Let's connect the binaries, right? Let's make the connections and understand the injustices of the past, right? So then we can try to work against and minimize the injustices of the past.
Yes, see, I'm glad that you mentioned that idea of neither nor or having the binaries as separate entities, because that's what is causing the tensions in the globe, like the right and the left, and you name it. And as you were speaking, it reminded me when I visited Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui in Bolivia a few years back, and then she told me about this idea of the plurialogo. And plurialogo, it's different from dialogue. We're having a dialogue, you and me today here through internet. But she said plurialogo is beyond that. The plurialogo is those connections and relationships among all peoples, including Mother Earth, the land, the Pachamama, she says, the water, the animals, living and not living beings, and is that dialogical or pluridialogo, as she was saying. And then that way, the more we are in tune with that, the more we're moving away from those binaries that we're discussing. And other folks that I think you yourself had also talked about diálogo de saberes, diálogo de conocimientos, the dialogue of knowledges and dialogue of, knowledges, conocimientos, saberes is almost the same in Spanish and I guess Portuguese as well. But the dialogue of these knowledges that is like we have to hierarchy the knowledges that is one or the other, that one is better than the other, but it's more about to try to find those connections as you mentioned. And I found it very important what you just said.
Yes, in fact, you mentioned Cusicanqui, Rivera Cusicanqui. We have a Brazilian thinker from a Quilombo. He's a Quilombola thinker, who is an Afro-Brazilian thinker, Antonio Bispo, or Mestre Bispo, he's called. He's not an academic, but he's a philosopher of these communities, and he produces a lot of very important, interesting knowledge, which is not written academically. And one of the things he says, he calls the dominant culture in Brazil, the white dominant culture in Brazil, he calls it colonial, right? And so he says, for him, he says, our Afro-Brazilian ways of thinking in Brazil, and as you know, in the Afro-Brazilian population in Brazil is 57% of the population.
Yes,
right?
yes.
So, and he says, our Afro-Brazilian population in Brazil is not concerned with dichotomies. You people are concerned with dichotomies because you people, meaning the white minority, the dominant white minority in Brazil, because you use your European Christian ideology. In the European Christian ideology, you only have two possibilities. You have God and the devil. He says,
Yeah.
we, in our Afro-Brazilian thinking, we are polytheists.
Yeah.
We have many gods, right? And we don't have a single strongest God. Our many gods can fight against themselves. They don't have, there's not only one who has to be right all the time, right? They can disagree amongst themselves. So we don't have to be either on the side of God or the devil, right? And we can have different gods. So this is what permits us to think differently,
Right.
and to live in this in a world of difference and plurality. So
Absolutely.
yes, I think it's important to have a community of knowledge. I would call it an ecological form of thinking, and he uses this because he's an agricultural worker, and he says it's important to connect the rain, the rivers, with what we eat and drink.
Right.
So we have to make these connections.
But speaking about rivers and land or territories, I want to ask a question, a provocative question. Let's see how it goes, in the sense that for a long time, folks have been talking about decolonization, but for some indigenous communities, decolonization means something different from what a lot of folks have said, meaning it's about the land and it's about give me the land back, right? The rights of the land that I have. Because of colonization, you took my land and you took my territory and you took my culture and you destroyed my culture. You erased my languages as well, and I want that back physically and politically. And I feel like in the past few years, this idea of decolonization, descolonization, I feel like it's becoming like a little bit of a trend, and it has move away from the core or sentiment of what decolonization might be, when what Yongo wanted to talk about decolonizing the mind, and when the French Europeans invaded Africa and white and so on and so forth. So it has lost that sort of political and resistance aspects of what it is. And so a person might say, oh, I'm doing a decolonial class, and then what do you mean a decolonial class? Oh, well, we are reading Afro-Americans or Afro-Colombians or and this month. And for me, it's like, yes, you read about Afro-Colombians or Afro-descent or Afro-Americans this month in class, and people are proud of Black heritage and whatever. But then what happens after that month? So see, that's what lately I've been, especially in education, I've been seeing a lot of these things, like in my personal opinion, there's nothing necessarily wrong, but I would call that more like critical education, but not necessarily colonial education. For me to be colonialist, there has to be some kind of political fight on the base.
Exactly. I agree totally. I think, unfortunately, and many people have said this as well, decolonization theory has become more like a trend or a fashion or bandwagon. And I've been very critical of decolonization in Brazil, especially because I said, how can we in Brazil speak of decolonization and everybody in our universities now wants to be decolonial if you don't talk about racism? Now, our Brazilian Academy will not, because our Brazilian Academy is white, very few, you'll see very few non-whites in our Brazilian Academy.
There you go.
So it's a very colonial academy. And so our Brazilian white academy wants to be decolonial, but it doesn't want to make connections with racism or with the indigenous problem, right? So they'll say, oh, well, the indigenous population in Brazil is less than 2% of the population. Okay, but our Black population is 57% of the population, right? And so how many in my 35 years of at the university, in 35 years of teaching PhD students, I've only had three Black PhD students,
Hmm.
3 in 35 years.
Wow, good to know.
I mean, how can we claim to be decolonial, if we don't challenge racism? Now, you mentioned, I think it was important that you mentioned Wationgo's decolonization of the mind.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that we forget, and that colonization, and this is what Ngugi says in his book, colonization affected the way we think.
Yeah.
It made us think in a way that we assumed was a natural way to think. It was not natural for us. It was a conventional way of the colonizers, and they colonized us. And through the process of colonization, we began to think like them.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So we don't need the colonizer to colonize us anymore, because we colonize ourselves.
Yeah.
And this is what Ngugi was saying. We colonize ourselves. So, the first thing we have to do for us and here I'm speaking from Brazil, before we want to become decolonial, is let us decolonize ourselves. Let us reflect on how we continue to think from a colonial point of view.
Mm.
We continue to give importance to the theories that come from the global north. We don't, let me give you an example of language and linguistics.
Yes.
I started off by saying it's always, the way we theorize is always biographical, not individual, but biographical. So when we consider that the way language is, we imagine language, and here we speak of Ferdinand de Saussure as the Swiss linguist, as being the father of modern language, modern linguistics, that he was thinking of language like a European thinks of language.
Mm-hmm.
Like a European monolingual thinks of language.
Right.
Now, if you ask a Latin American indigenous person, if you ask an African, or if you ask an Asian, people who live in multilingual communities, they don't think language like a European monolingual does.
Right.
Right? Because they speak many languages at the same time.
Right.
So there's not a connection between language and space. Now I'm in this space, now I speak this language. No, now I'm in the space where I was born, where I live, and in the same space there are people that speak many languages. So this means we have to have different theories to rethink language. We can't just use this idea of abstract system and practice, which we inherited from you, right? The difference between language as abstract system or language as concrete practice. That doesn't make sense anymore. Because if we look at language from the perspective of plurilingual speakers in the South, we have to start with practice, not with abstract system. We start with practice, and this is what the Indian sociolinguist Lakshman Kupchandani does. He says, we have to stop thinking from language as beginning with grammar. Let's start thinking, how does a plurilingual person speak to another plurilingual person? Okay, so I know all of these many languages of my community. How do I choose which language to speak when I come across a person within my own community? How do I decide which language? It's not grammar. And here it is ethics. And he suggests it is ethics that's much more important than grammar, or at least as important as grammar, because the ethic will say, the person I'm speaking to is part of my community, so he needs the respect. I have to respect him, right? The person I'm speaking to is necessary for my existence, because I either need to buy something from this person, sell something from this person, to communicate something from this person, get information from this person. I have to live with this person. So it's an ethical, language is an ethical necessity, right? So I'm not going to say to this person, oh, you you don't speak my language, I'm sorry, come back when you learn my language. Right? Or speak correctly. No, the important thing is to maintain the conversation going with this person. So both me and this person have to make adjustments. We have to make constant attempts to understand each other.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. You got me thinking about when you say ethics is more important than grammar, you got me thinking of the teachers that I have worked for a while in Colombia, which they constantly say to me, for us, the human or being human is more important than teaching the verb to be, the present tense, the past tense, the irregular and irregular verbs. When we have a little kid who has not eaten breakfast today, or whose father has been killed by the violence in the streets, and so on and so forth. So for these teachers, we're going back a little bit to the South, it's very important mostly to take care of these children or these students in public schools first than attempting to teach the language. That's what I agree with you with this idea.
Yep, totally. And in Colombia, yes, you have the peace, the necessity of peace for
Right.
coexistence,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Which is an ethical necessity.
Yeah. Yeah, and speaking of ethical necessity, like you were mentioning earlier, this ecology of things. What do you think? Like, if we're trying to unbalance those dichotomies, south or north, and do and not done, and the tensions, what do you think? Because you have obviously a vast experience both as a person, but as a scholar, professor, researcher, all of these things. What do you think would be the way to move forward in the near future? In terms of language teaching, language research, applied linguistics, where do you think we should all going? Because if the colonization has become a trend, a fashion, a bandwagon that everybody's going, DEI, like diversity, equity, and education is becoming another wagon that everybody just paints a little bit here and then keeps going, but nothing gets changed. So in your experience, where do you think we should move forward in the next 5, 10, 20, 50 years, and hopefully we get somewhere at some point?
Well, I could say what I think, but what I think comes from what I've read and what I've learned and the different ideas I've come across, right? So, and I would say this first, and I say this when I speak to teachers, language teachers. First, we have to, when we're teaching language in a classroom, especially in a public school classroom, right? Remember that all our students have language, all our students have knowledge, right? Now, they may not have the language that you expect them to have, they may not have the knowledge you expect them to have, right? But they have language and they have knowledge. They have the capacity to think and to communicate. They have the capacity to produce knowledge. All of us do. So we have to begin from this presupposition of equality. Here I'm referring to a term by the French philosopher Jacques Rancière. We begin with equality. Equality is not something that we will reach at the end of the process of teaching. Let us begin with equality by accepting our students as being equal to us. Right? Now, what is the problem? They are equal to us. They also have language. They are capable of producing knowledge, right? But they don't have the knowledge that they will need, the knowledge that we call classroom knowledge or academic knowledge or the curricular knowledge. They don't have that, right? So then what we are doing is something, we're not giving them knowledge. We're not giving knowledge to people who are ignorant, right? We're not teaching language to people who have no language. So what are we doing? We are adding on to what they already have, the knowledge that they have, the language that they have. Right? So we are expanding a basis that they bring to our classroom, right? A basis of language, a basis of knowledge. And that is our job as teachers. How can I understand what they are bringing, the knowledge they're bringing, the language they're bringing, and how can I make this more adequate to the needs of the classroom or the needs of the curriculum? That is my job. My job is not to teach them presupposing that they know nothing, right?
Right. No, like it's funny because you actually got me thinking about Paulo Freire. Now you being a
Yep,
a Brazilian, and we talk about the banking system of education,
that's
that
right.
because that's the mentality for a long time. Even today, people think that our students are just empty vessels, that we just need to put the little things in there so they know. But you're right. It's like everybody has some kind of knowledge. That's why I call it funds of knowledges, as in the
That's
plural,
right.
meaning
That's
you
right.
have like a library of not only one languages but many languages. That's why sometimes we think that it is sort of, we have to be cautious about discriminating academic knowledge versus social knowledge versus street knowledge, because at the end of the day, we it's not like we go jumping from one room to the other, or from, it's like we are whole beings, and our jobs as educators and researchers, as you mentioned, is expanding on what you, the students, or us are having, and make it, I would say, more robust or better for our society, I guess, right? So we can function in society better. So instead of equality or equity, as you mentioned, to be the end product of the work, it should be the medium in which we all work together throughout life until like
Yeah.
forever, right?
This has been,
Yeah.
our modernity and modern science has uh, uh, has made us difficult to think of certain things which are right under our noses. For example, like positivism in modern science, right, has made us think of products and things. So we tend to think of knowledge as being something that exists all the time, right? Knowledge is a product, it exists. This is knowledge. And if there and anything different to this is not knowledge. So we always think in positive terms, when I think we should stop, what we've learned from Einstein and quantum physics. When Einstein looked at the movement of the atom, and he said, is it an atom? Is it a particle, or is it a wave? Sometimes the atom looked like a particle. It appeared here and there and here and there. Or sometimes it looked like a continuous wave. And then the conclusion that Einstein reached was, no, it's not either a particle or a wave. It's because it's the observer that interacts with the atom that is being observed. And as observers, we are constituted of atoms ourselves, right? So an atom is not something, a positive element that exists in a particular way with certain characteristics, or doesn't exist in a particular way, right? It's something dynamic. Let's think of it as a process and not as a product, right? Now, what happens if we think of knowledge as a process and not as a product? What happens if we think of language as a process and not as a product? Then what we will see is that when we think of knowledge as a process, then knowledge is always a constant movement of acquisition, of learning. There is never an end point where we can say, now we know everything. Right? So in other words, knowledge is moved by ignorance. What characterizes knowledge is ignorance. What makes me want to learn more is the fact that I don't know. Why do I need to learn a language? Because I don't know that language. So not knowing is so important in the process of acquiring knowledge that we forget. Ignorance is what stimulates us to learn. So, this is a Belgian thinker, Isabelle Stanger, speaks of something called cosmopolitics. Sounds very, very complicated, but basically, what she's saying is, when we all understand that we are ignorant in something, the philosopher Jacques Rancière also speaks of, when he speaks of the ignorant schoolmaster.
Right.
When we all understand that we all know something and we're all ignorant of something, that is our basis of equality. Right? So if we all agree that when we're living together on a planet and avoid all of these binaries of North and South, let's all agree, North and South, that there is something that we don't know and something you don't know, right?
Mm.
So let's bring together what we don't know, meaning what can I learn from you and what can you learn from me?
Yeah.
Hmm? Then we have a different way of doing politics. We have a different way, a different kind of pedagogy, right? And here I'm talking about going beyond Freire, because Freire was a man of his time, as he had to be,
Yeah.
right? So now I can read Freire and see the gaps. So if Freire had been alive today, he would be saying what I'm saying.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you. You are the upgraded version of Freighter.
Yeah.
My God. So that, you know what? One thing that got me thinking is it is true. Like capitalism, neoliberalism, globalization, and other socioeconomic sort of tentacles in life for a while have put language at the center of a product, right? And as a languages, or in this, and also English, obviously as part of that process, as a commodity, and it's been sold that to get it as a resource so you can use, or as a commodity to get you from point A to point B in the social ladder, right? However, I agree with you that when we, because my question earlier was to help us, how can we move forward in a future that we can live well with each other? It's about seeing the language instead of a byproduct of a product that can buy and use and eventually commodify. It's about the process, and within that process, learning from you and you learn from me, and it becomes this continuous learning, as you said, as a stimulus to be curious about who you are, where you're coming from, what is your culture, what values or not you have. And it got me thinking, there is this doctoral student at the University of Michigan that I met this year at the Applied Linguistic Conference in the United States. Her name is Yetunde, and she's theorizing right now, so I am amplifying this for her. She mentioned, you see, but language is beyond that. Language is a gift. And because she has a daughter and she has lived in communities for a long time, she said, for us, language is not a product. It's not, and it is definitely a process, but beyond that is something that I give to my daughter, that the communities gives to their children and everybody else, as a way to strengthen who we are and be humans and be more in relation to us and the cosmos and the nature. And it got me thinking, in a way, I like that she's theorizing this, and then she's be publishing something soon. But I just wanted to highlight the work that she's currently doing at the University of Michigan, because I think she's right, and I think that's I personally want to go into that direction. That is studying how can we start thinking. Some people say, "Oh, you see, but you are too romantic," but I guess we, at some points, I wish we could be more romantic and talk about these things from the heart, so to speak, right? Like, yes, it's I was taught Spanish by my mother and my peers because they care and they want me to use this language, is because they want you to be okay. Like, when mothers correct us all the time, like, oh, you say this, you don't say that. Or for example, when you are in different social relations, they always tell you, I hear you don't say this, you say this, start doing this. In a sense, yes, because of our social norms, but in another sense, it's because I care about you. And I know that this language, if you keep using it like this, that's going to get you into trouble. So I'm going to give you this knowledge of how to use language so you can actually thrive and survive and eventually be happy. So I'm glad that you brought this up about the idea of language as a process, continuous process of knowing and not knowing, learning from you, you learning from me, and then we keep growing. And I think that's good.
Yeah, yes, if we you probably have this in Spanish, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But in Portuguese, we have the expression to give birth in Portuguese is dar a luz,
That I lose,
right?
yes,
To give the light to someone, right?
right.
So yeah,
So
so and this is what mothers do. So when mothers give birth, they're giving knowledge, they're giving voice, they're giving life, right? And so language is life, language is love, language is all of this. And I don't think it's, the criticism of being, because love is not about being romantic. Love is about being ethical and being practical. And here I'm thinking of Umberto Maturana, Biology of Love, right?
Yes.
When for Maturana, love is a biological process of interconnection between one organism and another, because he says all organisms need to be connected in order to survive, right? So love is this interconnection. If we don't have love, we don't connect with other organisms. How can we survive?
Yeah. Yeah. Maturana also said,
More love, please.
Maturana was the one who said, lenguajear is part of that.
That's right.
Lenguajear,
That's
he was
right.
the one like 50 years ago, used the word in Spanish lenguajear, and later the North Americans used languaging. But for
That's right.
Maturana, is beyond languaging, is not just this act of using
It's not
language.
just, it's not verbal. It's not verbal. Yeah.
No, lenguajear is more like, as you mentioned, is about emotions and feelings and relationships, and not, is a little bit romantic. And that's what I was saying earlier at the conference this past week. Like, say, maybe perhaps I need to write romantic applied linguistics, a book, because I think we need more love and less.
I think, in living in a neoliberal times where everything is competition, and everybody likes to say, I need my freedom, as if we are individuals who came from nowhere, as if we dropped out of the sky. We didn't come from nowhere. We are individuals who are born into language. We are born into ideology. We are born into conventions. We are not individuals who are disconnected, right?
Exactly.
So, and we have to understand and respect these connections that we are born into. In other words, we have to love them more. They have given to us. It's our connections that have made us who we are. Right?
Exactly. Oh, absolutely. So we're about to finish today, because I don't want to take much of your time. I'm aware of you. You're a busy person. You have things to do with your significant others, but also with your academic work. I just want to thank you so much for coming today. Is there anything that you wanted to say? You want to send anything to the audience? And I thought an idea that you might be thinking about, but you didn't say today.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I should have, I think it's always important to think about the planet that we all live on, right? We're going through this terrible, tragic climate tragedy, so this is something that we can no longer reverse, right? So how are all of these things related? When we're talking about language, we are talking about interconnections. Our planet has reached this stage of disaster and tragedy because each community only looked at the planet as from its own perspective, from a very selfish perspective, right? And now we are universalizing the tragedy. Now when the tragedy has already begun, we are socializing the tragedy, right? So I think it's time that we really paid more attention to our planet and the tragedy that has already come upon us.
Yeah, this is actually a good way to wrap up today, because as in the ILA conference last week, we heard Arturo Escobar, who's very important in the pluriversal politics aspects in which we all should care about planet Earth, all humans and non-humans, beyond humans. And I think that's a good way to finish today and wrap up, to see how applied linguistics, language research, language education from the global North and the global South can connect all together to salvage the planet. Because we're not getting any younger, we're getting wiser, but we need to leave a good planet worth living once we're gone. Thank you so much, Lynn Mario, to come today for these Capsulxs. We're gonna wrap up right now. Thanks for the audience for coming here today. And then you have any questions or something, feel free to send us an email or on the chat box, put a little note. All right.